I think what's interesting is often people talk about cronyism, crony capitalism, and they talk about populism. When I was thinking about preparing this talk, what I found very interesting is in many parts of the world, these seem to go together. And so I started thinking, is there something common, structural, functional about this? So by populism, I think the key common characteristics are actually anti-elite, anti-establishment, pro some kind of nativist core group, but also very typically in history economically nationalist, often protectionist, often is also characterized by a charismatic leader who has a close direct connection with the people and often with authoritarian tendencies. Now, one part of that, the anti-elite, seems to be completely anti-cronyism. And indeed, in India, the anti-corruption movement and the second part of the UPA was very much around against daily corruption, but focused around the big scams, which were clearly cronyist. So that seems to be a real tension. I think that tension is there. Having said that, I think the economically nationalist part can often be in favor of like our entrepreneurs, our capitalists, provided that is managed by the populist entrepreneur in a way that is consistent with the anti-elite, anti-establishment, man of the people. I can't think of a case of a woman of the people who's a popular man of the people narrative. Now, what this means often in practice is that the populist leader will often have the connections, but will also need the connections with key business capitalists because of the essential need for the functioning of the economy. They need it for the jobs, need it for political finance. So you end up with actually a structure in which the political leadership has their cronies, and this works, has a primary political strategy that is populist. And where it works best politically is if actually the cronies aren't associated with kind of rampant extortion, but are ideally part of an economic nationalism, and even better if they are relatively untransparent. Thinking of India in a kind of historical and global context, I think it's quite interesting that I'd say a couple of things. One is India's particular characteristics now have a classic populist structure overall of being a common narrative, certainly under this government, of being of the people, kind of anti-elite in terms of the narrative, having this, in this case, the Hindutva is very aligned with what in other countries and historically maybe a more nativist, and being economically nationalist. That we've seen historically in many cases in history. What is very interesting in this global moment, though, is that if you look around the world, we see many cases where there's actually the blend of cronyism and populism, and I would argue in some cases what I would call a political equilibrium that is sustainable. Certainly the United States. Trump has been, I disagree with most things that Trump does, but he has been brilliantly channeled the populist energy whilst also being, quote, pro-business. And that he's been managing that tension very successfully, sustaining the base, and people don't seem to mind that toleration. And he needs the support as well of the business as well as the base. We see it in the Brexit movement in the UK, many of the movements in Europe, in more extreme terms, what's happening in Hungary, very populist, very nativist, anti-immigrant. That's one of the dark sides. But also with the cronyism, we see it. I see it in Turkey under Erdogan. Came in under a movement of anti-corruption against the against the elites and moderate Islam, but then very much moved, maintaining a more intensified Islamic base, but moving into utilizing corruption and cronyism basically to finance it. So this is a common pattern. Second thing I say, I think what's interesting about India is the contrast within. And this raises the question of where cronyism and populism, where it comes together, can be good and bad for development. What's interesting about India, in the southern states, and Tamil Nadu is particularly striking, the history of the last few decades has been a particular political configuration, which is clearly cronyist, stacks of corruption, tight deals between the alternating political parties and Tamilian business, very good at extracting rents from the center when they're in coalition, and also clearly very populist, sometimes just handing out TVs, but sometimes populist being associated with not too bad social welfare policies. That's a case where it came together. We're not saying cronyism or populism is good, but it was pretty effective at supporting a good development dynamic. The interesting question is that it seemed to be contingent on this particular history, even this particular party structure. Even we know of Jayalalitha that she kept very centralized control over the business links. Anecdotally, the AMK was much more decentralized, but it was something that was known, what in economic jargon you call a repeated game. You know the game, you know the rules. Now, with both of these great leaders of these two parties passing away, it's a really interesting question whether the system will hang together, or whether there will be a transition to a more predatory kind of rent extraction. So how might crony populism unfold in a political economy sense is a really interesting question. If the cronyism intensifies, there is a tension, and it could become inconsistent with the populist political strategy, especially if it becomes more diffuse, and if another political entrepreneur can actually ride on a kind of out-populist the populist. That's one scenario. Another scenario is it could fall into what you might call the temptation to intensify the populist side without actually really succeeding in long-run development. Sooner or later that comes to root. Or it could spill over into more conflict, which is more the Latin America is a very interesting region where the scale of the inequalities are so large that a populist resolution is rarely stable, typically spills over into excessive spending. That's the only way that it can be sustained. And then there's a lurch back following a crisis to a less populist, often, quote, more right-wing situation. And so it's that's another evolution. The most optimistic view is that the populist energies, which are genuinely what we want, governments being responsive to the people, become more inclusive and actually lead to a steady transition towards a more social developmentalism, what I like to think of what is needed is a different kind of 21st century kind of social democracy, which is actually strengthens the democratic institutions, but at the same time reaches broad the desires and aspirations of the people, but through mechanisms that are efficient in social terms, in terms of managing risk, managing redistribution.